Okay, great. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our last Panoramas Roundtable discussion of the semester. So sad. For those of you who don't know, Panoramas is an online student-led publication dedicated to the news, research, culture, and art of Latin America, the Caribbean, and the Latinx and Caribbean diasporas. Please like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and also subscribe to our newly revamped newsletter that we are very proud of to stay up to date with Panoramas throughout the summer and then also next semester, next year. Today, all 8 of our interns, both year-long and semester, will be exploring the relationship between land, activism, and Indigenous peoples in Latin America. This is a subject that we all hold really dear to our hearts, and the students all worked really hard on these articles and this research throughout the semester and on the presentation. So I ask you keep in mind that this is only a short presentation of the work that they've done. And I encourage you, if you have not already, to read their articles, which you can find on our website and in the newsletters. And a quick disclaimer that this is a wider perspective on a very big topic, and it's presented through a set of case studies that are very relevant and often politicized. So please keep that in mind during the discussion and through the presentation. While the students are presenting and during the discussion, please use the chat feature for any comments or reactions, and then please use the raise hand feature that you'll find on the participants icon of your screen when we get to the discussion. Can you see? You can still see my screen, right? So anyone wants to scan the QR code, go for it. Now's your chance. And let's begin.
Do I start okay, so this is our presentation, Reflections on Earth Day. Excuse me. Case studies on cultivation and control of Indigenous land, as Kaylin previously stated. So this next section, next slide. Just a brief look at the landscapes were like before European colonization. So next slide again. This is just a brief reminder to continue debunking the pristine myth, right? People were not frolicking around aimlessly, before colonization. And nomadic people were not lesser than other civilizations, even within, Mesoamerica and South America, who had hierarchies and pyramids and such. And I say this because many discussions, about environmental activism and indigeneity today continue to paint this picture of returning to a time when we lived in harmony with nature and had very little impact on the landscape, which is A, it's false, and B, I would argue that it's relatively impossible. Humans have always had a terrible impact and great impact on the environment. So I'm going to go over a few of these examples and some of like early farming practices and other ideas that are derived from Miller's book, An Environmental History of Latin America, which is a great read, by the way. So, Columbus's descriptions of the continents, early on were really what justified this violence against the land and Indigenous peoples. So like living in harmony with nature implies that Indigenous peoples had no impact on the environment or any knowledge about it really, and that they were surviving by luck, living on a land that Columbus himself described kind of like the Garden of Eden, a garden flowing with honey and, bounded with fertile fields and all this stuff, which was just not true. Indigenous peoples were throwing seeds into the forest to make sure that they knew they would track where they had planted those seeds, where they knew they could go back to. So they were actually performing agroforestry. So we have to think about if colonizers could paint people like animals, just happening to survive in a naturally luscious environment, it kind of justified their enslavement and their abuse and seizing of their land and resources. And so finally, with this point, I think that the Indigenous peoples had intricate rituals and sacrifices, of animals for agricultural purposes. So specifically to call for rain and fertile harvests and stuff, which included like bloodletting and starving animals and like dogs and guinea pigs and llamas and stuff. And those probably contributed to those early notions of like barbarism and such. However, you have to think about how much coordination was needed and how many resources were needed to actually come up with that many animals to ritually sacrifice and not use for food, right? So it was a lot more complex. And so I want to give an early example of this knowledge of the human impact on the environment before colonization and looking at lake sediment cores in the Andean region. So anywhere in soil and in water, you're going to have sediment buildup, debris buildup, organic material buildup, and that's going to harden into sedimentary rocks. And so what we can do is we can take samples of those sedimentary rocks and date them, and we can look at like the DNA of them and look at the different layers and see what was going on at these different years. And so in the Andean region, they took these lake sediment cores at around AD 1000, and it showed that the region was dominated by weeds and grasses, and that there were very, very few native alder trees. And there was also evidence of soil erosion, which makes sense because if there's less tree roots holding the soil together, then the soil can just go wherever it wants, right? But then suddenly, the lake sediment cores show that there was a dramatic increase in alder tree pollen and a decrease in erosion rates. And they deduced that this transition couldn't have been natural because of how the forest was laid out, and there was still major human use in those regions. So what happened? Well, they also found reports of the Inca emperor himself kind of overseeing this alder planting, and he even like penalized people who were overforesting. And at the same time, they had developed a stove that was more efficient than what the Spanish had used for comparison when they first came. So they knew that they had an environmental impact, and they actually sought to make sure that they weren't over hunting regions, rotating their hunting grounds, and they started replanting trees and making sure that they weren't destroying that environment as much anymore. So the next slide. So the top right picture is showing the Waru Waru, which is a artificial agricultural plot. It's raised. And it's surrounded by ditches of water that they are also artificial. And I just thought that was really cool. And I wish I knew how to do that in my own backyard. I think that would be pretty cool. But these were normally found like in the Andean region up to 4,000 meters in altitude. And so in comparison to the other farming techniques like terracing in the region, these are called andenes. They were football field sized platforms that, completely deforested the mountains and put these terraces on there. And they followed the curves of the valley. And for irrigation, they just use gravity, right? And they use the mountain slopes and the angles of the mountains and built these vertical stone walls in between each of these terracing, the steps, right? That would help cascade the water down and trickle it through the mountain as it was sloping down. The next slide. So that was kind of an example of like completely altering the landscape in order to farm and get whatever use they would want out of it. But this is an example of working with natural cycles of flooding, specifically with the Omagua people in the Amazon. And so in tropical regions where it's raining all the time, you're going to have a lot of nutrient leaching. So not only from water just continuously running off into the rivers, but also dissolving the nutrients that are in the soil. And so what they did to make up for this is they just farmed along the riverbanks so that as it continued raining and the nutrients kept depleting, the flooding itself would actually deposit sediment onto their crops so that those nutrients could feed their plants and stuff. And I think that's really interesting because you would have to know when that flooding would occur. It would have to be well built enough to know, to make sure that it doesn't drown or that it's reaching the entire field and such. But next slide. So finally, when the Aztecs decided to settle in Tenochtitlan, which is now Mexico City, and to build a city on top of the lake, the Chinampas had actually long been there. So these Chinampas are like these meter by meter, not single meter, but like a few meters by a few meters, rectangular or square, lake bed piles of mud that they took, and as well as like vegetation and other compost, and they kept piling that up and building it up to about a meter above the water. And then they lined it with the tree roots, and they encouraged the tree roots to intertwine with the fencing. And it would produce up to 7 harvests per year, which in comparison to like terracing and the other forms was about 2 to 3 harvests, which is really awesome. And they didn't even need to let it rest. It was so fertile. And what's more impressive, in my opinion, is the water diversion and the conservation efforts. So this was a lake, here, Mexico City was built on a lake, which means that there's really no inlet or outlet because it was actually completely bounded by land. And so the only input of water that you're getting is rain or a little bit of runoff from the mountains. And so over time, the water was actually becoming salty, which kills crops, right? And so what did they do to make up for that? And also to prevent the effects of drought and flooding, they built causeways and dikes and dams and other forms of water diversion to actually control the flood direction and irrigate water from farther away into the lake to make up for that. So.
All right, so during last week's roundtable, I discussed the impact that flora and fauna had on the environment in the Americas. So I want to revisit the topic a little bit and discuss what factors impacted the pre-Columbus indigenous ways of life. So to do this, I'm going to separate the factors into 3 different categories, which are time, environmental change, and colonization. It's important to note that cultural change is an extremely complex process that has many causes and effects, so we must approach this subject holistically. That being said, all cultures change over time, and at different degrees and at different speeds, they adapt. And so I suppose that time can be used as a kind of umbrella term in which environmental change and colonization fall under. Additionally, with time comes invention. New products and new ideas change how people function within a given culture. For example, when Stephanie went over the terracing and the chinampas, there was a period of discovery and invention in that, which ended up playing a significant role in how Native people developed agriculturally. The introduction of flora and fauna by way of the Columbian exchange resulted in significant environmental change as well. Some plant introductions include bananas, sugar, coffee, wheat, and rice. Some animal introductions include horses, cows, pigs, goats, and chickens. Bananas were one notable introduction and were quickly adopted by the people in the Americas, and they were the most notable introduction from Asia because they offered significantly more calories per acre than wheat and potatoes. Horses were another notable introduction because they offered a new source of traction or pulling power, which made plowing feasible in the Americas for the first time. As flora and fauna grew in their new environments rapidly, in some cases, they also consumed resources at an unsustainable rate. In some vulnerable areas like the Caribbean, for example, livestock ruined soils for indigenous farming, which resulted in many indigenous people turning to ranching to survive. And ranching is an interesting subject in itself, as it became the most extensive economic activity in the Americas at the time. Next slide. So there can be so much said about how colonization affected the ways of life of indigenous populations. So I'll go over just a few effects. So for one, the arrival of Europeans introduced various diseases to the Americas, such as smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza. And this resulted over time in tens of millions of indigenous deaths, which easily affected how indigenous people went about their daily lives. It also wasn't long before silver, gold, and diamond mines sprouted from the ground. Banana and sugar and coffee plantations took over the landscapes, and indigenous populations were used as the workforce, which interrupted ways of life and were some major causes of deforestation. And these are just some of the factors which contributed to the displacement of indigenous populations as Europeans settled in the Americas, and to the changing of indigenous culture and ways of life. The effects of colonization are still felt to this day. And one of the more pressing issues is that of deforestation to the world, yeah, but especially to the indigenous people who still consider places like the Amazon their home.
Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about deforestation, as Luke mentioned, which is still a pressing issue to this day. So specifically, Peyton and I are going to be taking a look at large-scale agriculture and the impact that it's having on ecosystems in Brazil. So just to give you a map of where we're talking about, I have the map of different ecosystems within Brazil. So the 2 that we're talking about today are the Amazon, which obviously is up at the top, and the Cerrado, which is less known, but is just to the south of the Amazon. So talking first about the beef industry and the impact that it's having on the Amazon. Brazil is the largest beef producer in the world and growing. Currently, Brazil represents about 20% of the global beef market, and by 2028, it's expected that they will represent about a quarter. This growth has largely been fueled by an increase in demand by people who are increasing in income in other parts of the world and are therefore able to afford what has traditionally been a more luxury item. While it's great that people are able to afford these more expensive products and that Brazil is able to economically benefit from that, there are a lot of issues with the beef industry, the way that it is operating currently in Brazil. The most obvious example of this is deforestation. So between 1988 and 2014, 63% of Amazon deforestation that occurred was a result of the beef industry clearing out pastures within the Amazon, principally by larger companies such as JBS. There are technically laws that ban this practice, but there is a very easy loophole in it that leads to a practice called cattle laundering. The laws place a lot more emphasis on and accountability on the meat processing plants rather than the ranchers and bigger companies themselves. So as a result, what often happens is that the cattle spend most of their life living on deforested land and grazing there. And then at the very end of their life, right before they're going to be slaughtered, they are sold to a so-called clean farm that meets the government standards where they can then be sold without having any problems for the processing plant. On top of that, currently, as you probably know, Jair Bolsonaro is the president of Brazil, and he has been very open about wanting to, quote unquote, develop the Amazon. So he is very in favor of this sort of behavior. And so it's very unlikely that we'll see any changes in the laws or the enforcement thereof going forward. There are a lot of consequences as a result of the deforestation that the beef industry has been deeply involved in. Obviously, there is the destruction of biodiversity, as well as the destruction of a major carbon sink, which is problematic not just for Brazil, but also for the rest of the world. Additionally, the main way that this land is cleared to make room for grass is through fires, which, if not properly managed, can result in forest fires, such as what the world witnessed in 2019, though this is an ongoing issue. And then finally, and most importantly, this has a massive human impact, and this has come in the form of the murder, sometimes the outright hunting and assassination, and displacement of Indigenous peoples from land that is supposed to be protected for Indigenous people by the government. There are a couple of solutions to the deforestation issue that could potentially make the beef industry in Brazil more sustainable. There are other sustainability issues outside of this, but addressing deforestation would undoubtedly make it significantly better. So the first is that companies such as Walmart and Timberland, for example, have committed to only buying meat or leather from certified deforestation-free farms. So we could see a change within the market that would make deforestation and raising cattle on deforested land less profitable and less feasible. Under a previous administration, there were credit incentives introduced for low carbon agriculture, and there are just generally more efficient ways to use the land that has already been cleared. These are great in theory, but they do have higher startup costs for things with regard to training and financial considerations as well, which make them a little bit harder to implement in practice. And then finally, there's Silva Pasture, which is basically when, rather than clearing out land for cattle to graze on with grass, they're able to graze among the flora and fauna that already exist, which would cut back on the need for deforestation. So these are a couple of ways that the beef industry could be improved and become more sustainable. But it's important that this is coupled with efforts such as reforestation and, more importantly, justice for the people who originally inhabited this land and were displaced by these practices.
So very similar to what Abby was talking about with the beef industry and the Amazon, it's important to look at the soy industry and the destruction of the Cerrado, which is the second largest ecosystem in Brazil, one of the largest ecosystems in all of South America. In fact, it's the largest savanna in all of South America. So Brazil, similar to the beef, is the world's largest producer of soy, and the Cerrado is is the monoculture. It's responsible for 2/3 of Brazil's soy output. So since its cultivation industrially in the beginning of the 1960s, before it was used mainly by indigenous groups, when the industry began in the 1960s, since then, over half of the Cerrado has been transformed into soy plantations as well as cattle ranches, which both support the soy industry as well as the beef industry. So that's only 50 to 60 years, and half of this gigantic region has been transformed into these industrialized, big business booms. And because of this, there's almost no environmental protection of the land. And in fact, because the Cerrado is just so relatively unknown compared to, a lot of the backlash that happens with the Amazon. Anytime that something bad happens with the Amazon, we hear about deforestation in the Amazon, and people are more likely to fight out against it. There's less coverage of the Cerrado. So the government, because of the economic prosperity that comes from the soy industry, actually places incentives for farmers and big businesses in particular to kind of go and industrialize the Cerrado region. In 2017, the soy production in Brazil kind of stabilized the economy and grew the agricultural sector by 13%. In 2020, profits grew by 10%, reaching almost $29 billion just from the soy industry in Brazil, which is kind of insane. So again, Cerrado farmers in general are only required to preserve 20% of the land that's used in the Cerrado, which is staggeringly low, especially when we look at cultivation efforts in the Amazon. The Cerrado, moreover, is actually deforested and destroyed at 4 times the rate that the Amazon is being destroyed, and little is being done about it. So there's so much that we can be doing, so much that can be said against these big, huge industries that are destroying this land. Additionally, even though we're bringing more light to this topic, soybean production is still continuing to grow. In the last growing season, it hit record highs in Brazil. If you want to go next slide. So the problems with industrialized agriculture, especially compared to the sustainable agricultural techniques that are used by indigenous groups, is that massive clear cutting and destruction of these regions leads to huge releases of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, again contributing to anthropogenic climate change as we understand it. So between 2002 and 2008, over 275 million tons of carbon dioxide were released just because of massive clear cutting efforts in the Cerrado. So, because there's little regulation, if we look at other areas of Brazil, which are leading to the soy industry, the other 1/3, the Cerrado still results in over 200 times more carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases being emitted to the environment. So although it takes up twice the space and twice the production, it's 200 times more effective and more detrimental to our environment. Additionally, if we look at the impacts of what monoculture does, monoculture being the continual use and cultivation of just one crop, in this case, it'd be soy, this has huge negative effects on the soil and therefore the ecosystem in the terroir in total. So if we continue to only use one crop year after year, this only pulls out certain nutrients. And if we completely, deplenish those nutrients in the soil, this can kill the soil entirely. Without that soil, plants can't grow there, and this has effects on the total animal biodiversity as well. The Cerrado and the Amazon, home to some of the most biodiverse places on the planet. And if we continue to, indulge in these monoculture efforts being done by these huge industries, we could lose these forever. So what does sustainable agriculture look like? If we look at how indigenous people use the land and their practices, how can we translate that to more sustainable practices used today? So I liked how Stephanie talked about, these people were still using the land. They were still being actively involved with the land. Compared to massive clear cutting efforts, they were using controlled burning. And when we see, ecologically, is that controlled burning and the implementation of secondary succession can be hugely beneficial for a region. Allowing nutrients to come back into the region, allowing new evolution and new adaptation to come back can replenish nutrients in the soil and make it healthier. Additionally, if we can fight for more environmental protection of the land and add incentives for farmers and these companies to kind of preserve the land they have, we have a better chance of being able to use it in the long run. Additionally, if we move away from monoculture and we kind of practice things that harmonize plants, I'm sure many of you have heard of like the Three Sisters model, which works on corn, beans, and squash, and how all of those, the nutrients that one takes and they give to the other ones, help all of them grow and it keeps the soil healthy. If we can practice that with the cultivation of soy, this could kind of really increase the soil longevity in the region. Second to last, less use of pesticides. If we look at the impacts of biomagnification on the plant life and the fauna of the region, just putting pesticides and chemicals on the plants here and the primary producers, the impact it has on the energy usage by our apex predators, it magnifies throughout the food chain. And finally, having respect for the land. If we can learn anything from how Indigenous people treat the land, it's that, having respect for it and understanding the use of sustainable practices is much more beneficial than just using it for our own production to maximize our output.
Okay, so I'm going to start talking about some of the implications that these trends have on Indigenous people. And I'm going to give the example of the Waju Indigenous tribe. So the Waju reside in the Guajira Peninsula, which is in the northeastern region of Colombia, bordering Venezuela, as you can see on the map. And the Guajira Peninsula is a semi-desert zone that is characterized by harsh environmental conditions. So before the drastic effects of climate change, the tribe used to survive by herding goats, creating crafts, and cultivating beans. But obviously, because of the effects of climate change, rapid urbanization, and the exploitation of natural resources, that's really affected the tribe's ability to practice sustainable farming. But besides these constant ecological and social challenges, the tribe has remained incredibly resistant to them. For example, a lot of Waju communities suffer from famine. And in times where there were droughts, they have relied on groceries subsidized by the Venezuelan government. But obviously, because of the situation in Venezuela, they have turned to the Colombian government for assistance in the form of food stamps. But thousands of Waju have died waiting for this assistance. So currently, the Waju are using their tradition of growing the guajiro bean to kind of mitigate the effects of climate change, famine, and other threats that are being posed. So the guajiro bean stands out because it fixes a lot of nitrogen in the soil that provides chemical support for other crops. And it's very adaptable to harsh climates like that characterize the peninsula. And that makes it a sacred crop for the Waju and a main ingredient in their traditional dishes. Also, many NGOs have found the guajiro bean to be a sacred or a promising crop that could really help these communities achieve food security. So this practice has worked particularly well for certain communities, such as the Ishashimana, which are part of the Waju, but they live in a zone that has more access to water. So this same process is a little bit more difficult to implement in other zones because obviously there is less access to water. So government support is needed and is really important if they want to dig wells and expand the irrigation system. And though support has been given especially from NGOs, these communities will still need long-term sustainable agricultural plans, with pumps to extract water or in the form of training programs on how to grow the bean. So despite the climate-related challenges that the Waju people and the Guajira residents face, it's not a lost cause, and it is a complex region, but it's not completely unmanageable. And as we've seen, there are solutions available through these indigenous agricultural practices that may help these communities prosper amidst these difficulties.
So now I'm going to talk about the Mapuche. If you could go back slide. Thank you. The Mapuche are an indigenous group that live in central Chile and a small part of west central Argentina. In the 16th century, they were sedentary people based on extended family units without any centralized authority, only really coming together for social and religious events. During the period of Spanish colonization, they reorganized their way of life in order to resist them, becoming nomadic. In fact, they were the only indigenous people to have their sovereignty recognized by the Spanish crown. But despite this recognition, the Spanish continued to attempt to annex them for 3 centuries. This autonomy changed again when Chile gained its independence from Spain in 1818. The newly created Chilean government integrated the once independent Mapuche and their land into their purview. And the Chilean army invaded their land in the 1880s. People were forced onto certain parts of it in reducciones, and the rest of the land was used for cities and farms. This reserved land was continually reduced until the middle of the 1900s, which during the Great Depression caused a mass urban migration of the Mapuche to cities. Reducciones were owned and farmed communally until the 1880s, when the Chilean government transferred ownership of land to individuals instead of the community as a whole. Next slide, please. The struggle for land rights worsened following the end of the Pinochet dictatorship in 1900. In 1990, the Pinochet-era anti-terrorist law that denies due process and triples the sentence has been used against Mapuche activists in order to silence them. But the future is looking brighter than the past, considering the Chilean people voted overwhelmingly to rewrite Chile's constitution in 2020. That the current constitution was written during the military dictatorship of Pinochet and is the only Latin American country that does not acknowledge its indigenous population, much less culture and traditions. But 17 seats in the Constitutional Convention have been reserved for indigenous representatives, and 7 of those are allocated to the Mapuche. Some Chilean Mapuche still have hope for a nation that includes their Mapuche relatives across the border in Argentina, a political and geographical reality to match their shared culture.
Okay, so I chose to speak about the indigenous group known as the Garifuna, and I'm going to start with a quote from Garifuna activists regarding their efforts to undo environmental violence they face, and that is, our lands and our identities are critical to our lives, our waters, our forests, our culture, our global commons, our territories. For us, the struggle for our territories and our commons and our natural resources is of primary importance to preserve ourselves as a people. I can't read, but so I wanted to incorporate this first quote because it paints a clear image of how there's this codependent relationship between the health of the land and the health of the Garifuna. And to kind of define who they are and give you a sense of what they stand for, the Garifuna are indigenous African and Caribbean people simultaneously, and they're legally recognized as an indigenous group because of years of resistance, and they've been fighting for that title. I was going to say, environmentalism is deeply connected to Garifuna politics and indigeneity and food sovereignty, which is one of their largest concerns in the country. And I just wanted to note that indigenous resistance evidently is not limited to the cultural sphere, but it inhabits the material one as well, as their identities are tied to the land as well as, their culture is. So next. Okay, so the land the Garifuna occupy has been decimated due to colonization and the increase of large corporations exhausting their resources, like Chiquita Banana Company. We won't go into it. But with that, food sovereignty is central to Garifuna activism and ideas of development. And one of the groups that have worked to help fight for this goal is known as the Council of Popular and Indigenous Organizations of Honduras, hence the acronym at the beginning. And so that group is central to the Honduran environmental movement, and they consider itself and the members to be environmental defenders. That really sits with me. I keep thinking about it. And this group emerged from Honduran indigenous coalitions in the 1970s and has centralized the idea of food sovereignty since the 90s. And it's like wild to do any sort of activism, especially in Honduras, because in the current political climate of the country, environmental activism such as this is very dangerous. And notably in 2017, Honduras was deemed the deadliest country in the world for environmental activism, which is terrifying. So a distinct form of development will naturally embody environmental protection because their cultural relation to nature, right? And so through their culture, they wish to connect to and care for the land of the Honduran North Coast, and it is an integral idea to this idea of development. Oh my goodness. That said, multiple studies have found that indigenous farmers tend to maintain more ecologically diverse. I can't read today. Diverse farms than their non-indigenous counterparts do. My gosh. And overall, throughout my research, I just wanted to reiterate that Garifuna livelihoods and culture are connected intimately to the natural environment. And I wanted to end with this quote: "The earth is our mother, the sea is our father. When this relationship is broken, we are no longer Garifuna people." And therefore, I just wanted to state that reacquisition of the land they inhabit equates to overall environmental protection. Leaving the land in their hands will definitely increase the livelihood of the land, flora and fauna. So, thank you.
Okay, so as Ashley talks about the sacred connection between Indigenous people and the land, I wanted to kind of explore that topic more generally a little bit before we wrap up our presentation. And specifically, I wanted to look at how climate change is affecting Indigenous mental health, because the changing climate could be severing this sacred connection. And so there was a large scoping literature review that was done last year, and it was basically trying to answer this exact question. And they found some really important associations between certain weather patterns and certain mental health complications. And so what they found was that short-term weather variables, so things like storms or floods or just general temperature change, these were often associated with a higher risk for disorders like depression, anxiety, ideation of self-harm or suicide, and post-traumatic stress disorder. But when it came to climatic variables, things like drought, sea ice changes, wildlife changes, vegetation, things like that, these were more linked to emotional responses like worry, anger, loss, ongoing emotional distress, but they didn't have concrete connections to any definite psychiatric disorder. And so this accumulation of all this research brought about a lot of important patterns to take note of, but the majority of this research was actually conducted in Canada, Australia, and the United States. And so when they looked for research in Latin America, there was actually no empirical articles and no data published on this specific topic relating to Indigenous communities, mental health, and climate change. And so I wanted to explore this topic a little bit further and look at physical health, because we know that poor physical health can be a precursor for poor mental health. And so there was a book written by these two authors, Werner and Kronick, about a decade ago, and they focused on 3 specific regions in Latin America where the effects of climate change are especially daunting. And so when they looked at the Amazon, a lot of the main problem here is that Indigenous communities are reporting experiencing heat exhaustion, there's respiratory and intestinal diseases, and they've experienced fatigues and headaches. And so these problems can also be, like, we know heat exhaustion to also be associated with disorders like depression and anxiety. And then when they looked at the Andean region, specifically the Colombian part of the region, the main problem was precipitation variability. So that leads to diminished water supply, which then leads to a lack of crop cultivation, which then leads to malnutrition, developmental issues, and a damaged immune system. So this cascading effect of events is actually specifically hurting the Quechua and Aymara people in this area and can be detrimental to mental health as well. And then lastly, they looked at the Greater Caribbean region, which was encompassing some areas of Central America. And the main problems here are hurricanes, the destruction of the coral reefs and mangroves, And so a lot of communities reported a destruction of their natural resources, which not only can ensue food insecurity, but it's also going to lead to a loss of livelihood because a lot of their work is based in agriculture. And so all these occurrences that are affecting physical health can only infer that mental health issues would be exacerbated by these climatic stressors, but more research is needed that is specifically focusing on indigenous communities that reside in Latin America.
So really quickly before we go into the discussion portion of this roundtable, I mean, when we think about environmental change, whether that's by climate, deforestation, all these things that we've been discussing, Indigenous peoples are very often the first to face the brunt of these consequences. And since they're, whether it be spirituality, whether it be that they rely on the land to survive and to practice their traditions and cultures, and you know, they're very, very tied to these changes. And so a lot of times they're going to be environmental activists, environmental defenders, as Ashley put it. And with that comes questions of safety. So the next slide, please. So 331 human rights defenders were murdered across the world in 2020. That's a decently sized number. Yeah, go ahead. And 3/4 of those murders were in Latin America. That's a very, very large percentage. So predominantly in Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Honduras, Mexico, and Peru. And then if you go to the next slide, 69% of all those who were killed were environmental and indigenous land rights activists. So these people are being targeted by governments, probably by businesses, corporations. And it really brings into question, you know, on the one hand, indigenous and environmental activists, they are facing the brunt of those consequences, or the brunt of the problems that are happening, the environmental destruction. Therefore, they have the most knowledge of what is going on hands-on. However, it should not be left only up to them to fight for their rights and fight for the environment. So.
So that conclusion of the darkness and the real pressing issues from the human side and the climate side really bring us to our discussion questions. And that first question is general reflections on, that was a lot of information. Anything stand out to anyone in the audience or any of the students? And reflections on the presentation and on Earth Day, and how we celebrate Earth Day.
For me, a big thing is when Stephanie's going over those data points at the end, and just how prevalent the targeting in Latin America is. And we see like 75% of the 331 and the 69% of that, just how vast that number is when we look, particularly just what we've been talking about over the past 45 minutes and everything that we're trying to promote and things like that, and the people that are actually doing the things on the ground to fight for the earth, and how detrimental that is. And I don't think enough people kind of realize the impact that fighting for, our own planet has, especially in the face of huge companies and corrupt governments.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Peyton. And that kind of brings us to that second question of like, what is more detrimental? Is it the individual behavior of, us getting in our cars and driving to work? Or is it, and this might sound a little obvious, but I would like to open the floor to that discussion, like, or is it the big corporations, really murdering people and displacing people from their homes? And what can we control about either one of those? I'm going to paste these questions in the chat too to make it so we can all see each other. And feel free to use the chat or the raise hand feature. Come on, last round table.
Cool. So I have to go in a second, so I'm gonna answer this question. All right, cool. I will say very obviously in the way that you even posing the question, it's very obvious that it's corporations that are more in fault. And I feel like when we do talk about these things, we gotta remember that we gotta remember that there are these corporations that are doing these things. And I feel like too often, I know, because even like people like try to like shame people from my family who don't even have access to the more green options, quote unquote. So I feel like any individual kind of blaming the individual behavior works, if it even works in some cases, but not the other ones. And like, I feel like people need to be more conscious of that, but very obviously more corporations are the ones doing the heavier damage. I think, what, not the Lorax. All right, yeah.
I think that's a really good point, Dennis, when you were talking about like the individual kind of shaming the individual. That's kind of I feel like that's kind of a consequence of corporations and governments facing the environmental problem as the responsibility of the individual. And like you said, like if it truly were the responsibility of everybody and the governments wanted to support that transition, then they would make these environmental sustainable solutions more accessible. If it really was like, you know, the individual should change this and that, then make it accessible to us so that we can do that, you know. But even then, that's not a cut and dry solution because, you know, for example, one person might say that going vegan, it does have a very, very low environmental impact. It is a very healthy option, and I'm not bashing anybody, right? Or it's a great option, but it's not for everyone, right? Indigenous peoples have very, very strong spiritual, religious connections to certain animal meats, and they would like to continue doing that. And so one size doesn't fit all. And I think that's a good point.
Similarly, I think it's a really important kind of, Dennis, with your comment, it's a really important segue to kind of think about it from a local perspective too, and how we view sustainability as this, like how you said about shaming people and veganism, right? But like there's also the component of equity. When we, you know, shame people for, I don't know, like for example, food insecurity is a really prevalent issue in the Pittsburgh area. And it's like, oh, well, just eat more vegetables, right? It'll be better for your health and for the environment. But like the fact that vegetables are more expensive and harder to access and harder to find, harder to cook with, and like lower caloric intake. It's a matter of equity when we think about these things. And like green gentrification is something that a lot of local governments are having to kind of grapple with right now, right? You want greener spaces, you want neighborhoods and to be vibrant and a lot of money coming into them and economic opportunity and development, but then by gentrifying them, right, you bring a whole load of other problems coming in, and just how unequal and unjust that is in itself. So I think these big scale issues it's easy to think of as, you know, a problem of people living near the Amazon, but we do see similar issues, parallel issues happening in our own backyard in Pittsburgh or wherever the participants are.
Yeah, and I think we also have to think about like access to knowledge as well. Like who has the access to knowledge to make these greener choices that really aren't being like widespread, or like even, it's like they're not going to talk about being green on Univision. That was basically what I'm saying. But yeah, no, like it's very like, well, the words I'm trying to get. you have to be usually in a very privileged position to have access to this knowledge, basically. Yeah.
And on that note, not even access to the knowledge that we have with like green solutions and recycling and this and like this and that, but like the knowledge that Indigenous peoples have that they're willing to share, right? Of better use, farming, different foods, even, you know, that knowledge isn't as valued as much either. And so I guess the access to knowledge can go both ways.
I just have a relatively broad question, so feel free whoever wants to give a shot at it. But I like on this topic, I always find it somewhat hypocritical for Western countries, especially the United States, to really be concerned about the environmental impact of specifically agriculture, like in Brazil, whenever we and multiple other countries have played a part in this and taken from these countries and enriched ourselves. And now that we have accomplished so much and we have this advanced knowledge, we're so much better than everyone else because of all this stuff we've stolen, we now say to these countries, hey, you're not allowed to do this because it's bad for the world. So with that being said, is anyone aware of international agreements or incentivization towards these countries that aren't as developed economically to lean into the renewable resources, the more expensive in like overhead costs solutions that aren't necessarily the first option for countries in Latin America?
I believe that in the like 2019, 2018, they signed the agreement of Equasu. I don't know totally what it does, but my article for last week actually talks about the impacts of Western countries economically, like how we are critically. Pretty much your exact question is what my article from last week talks about, which hopefully will get published soon to kind of answer those questions. And it looks at the impacts of how critical we are because we've already reached the 5 stages of economic development on these other countries, and they're trying to do the most ecologically. But I believe this agreement of Equasu was signed by all of these countries to kind of promote environmental sustainability efforts. However, global legislation, things like the Paris Accords, which try to promote a global standard for like ecological agreement, they're very hard to enforce because there is no like international law. Again, there's no international repercussions for a country like the United States, like when Donald Trump wanted to pull us out of the Paris Accords. There's no real repercussions for that. And I think a large part of it is that, if we're trying to hold, kind of as you said, like if we're trying to hold these countries accountable, but, even after we try to do this and we pull out of things like the Paris agreements, we're still eating our words just like yet again. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, that works. I'll keep an eye out for your.
Yeah, I know. If it does, if you throw your email in the chat, I'll be happy to definitely send that to you when it comes out.
That was also like the whole premise of the SDGs and the Millennial Development Goals, right? Trying to keep equitable development in mind without not being equitable. Sorry, that second vaccine is hitting me now. Manuel, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, you might want to look into the investments that Denmark and actually other Nordic countries have been making for decades now, all over the developing world, in terms of credits and making essentially, paying for people to keep their forests going and more sustainable practices going. And I know last year we had somebody who was a fan of Guyana, a place where I spent a good bit of time in doing work. But in Guyana is actually, has been for a couple of decades working with Denmark in that respect. And yet, they struck it rich with petroleum finds that were plentiful and just off their coast. And now there's that sway. So Guyana, a country that, was pretty much bought into the whole idea. Oil came in and they gave them, potentially more money than they could have had from just keeping their forests. So, that's also a dilemma that developing countries face, right? It's fine to promote this and to entice and encourage, but the practical realities I see, and I have to say, all the presentations at the beginning, I mean, you did show nuance and consideration for these realities that are not just the pie in the sky ideal, right? There's practical aspects to survival, and so this is really the dilemma. It's not somebody coming in and just taking over. It's somebody saying, well, we'll give you, which is just a relatively, generally, I'm sorry to be cynical, but a relatively reduced elite who benefits from or gets the most benefit from a lot of these new opportunities to develop the country, and most of the population tends to not benefit equally. So you might want to look into those funds, because there's a long history and a lot of work that's been done, and it's actually the preamble to a lot of the sort of multilateral worldwide initiatives that are going to support sustainable life.
Okay.
So I was gonna say I did a project a week or two ago, but I specifically looked into maternal death rates and like post pregnancy death rates, everything. And so in Cuba, I found that they're actually really wonderful at caring for mothers, either like prior to the birth and after. And even though they're a more like resource poor place, they have a higher like success rate of births in comparison to like any of the more resource rich countries like us or Canada. So it really does come down to actually caring about the people that live there, because I know in Cuba they literally are like, every birth is like important to our development as a country. Like they actually humanize the people that live there rather than see them as gain for capital gain or something like that. So yeah, you reminded me when you said SDGs. So wait, yes, SDGs.
Manuel, is that a new hand or is that the same hand?
I like to keep my hand up for the exercise.
I kind of wanted to shift the conversation to one of the questions that we posted in the chat. What has been the impact of the pandemic, and then also movements against police violence and COVID-19 on environmental activism movements? Take that how you will. What the response has been both from the government and the people in these movements. And if not, in the interest of time, I didn't completely lost track of time. What ways we can uplift Indigenous populations, and then also how we can, what is our role in these movements? If any of the interns also want to take that question.
I can talk about this a little bit. So my thesis is working on dealing with the the water struggle in the Sonora, Mexico, of the Yaqui River. And I had an interview with someone who works closely with one of the town's leaders, Yaqui town leaders. And he was talking about how, I mean, he was jailed. His name's Mario Luna. He was wrongly jailed for a year. He was harassed. His family was harassed for fighting an aqueduct that was put into the river. And there are other defenders, Yaqui defenders, who are being targeted and harassed and imprisoned and stuff. And you know, this person that I was interviewing mentioned that he believes that one of the reasons why they have not just been completely either attacked or seriously like reprimanded for their protests is because of this national and international attention through social media and through other indigenous organizations, including like the Zapatista, army, and the Indigenous Council in Mexico, national, something like that, council in Mexico. And I don't know, I think that's really interesting because, he also referenced the reason why the Zapatistas, when they literally declared war on the Mexican government and like were burning buildings down, the reason why they weren't completely like annihilated was because of this news attention, the international attention. So I think spreading the word, it seems, there's a line between being performative with that, right? Because, you're just posting something. But at the same time, it could have an effect where there are all eyes on the situation, and that could literally be saving people's lives. And those are just a couple examples of that. And I think that continuing social media attention, promoting funding also, because funding, that money can go directly towards these people becoming sovereign, and not having to rely on the systems that are oppressing them. For example, the same group, the Yaqui, there was one music campaign that was raising money to build a music school. And this music school is completely on their territory, doesn't rely on anything else but their own tribal government, and that's what they do. And I think that's really, really cool. So funding is also good. So
thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, I think kind of to wrap up, putting our money and our voices where our voice is, right? Like really bringing up just difficult conversations with people who might have more power, and really advocating on behalf of people who might not be able to access the same spaces and audiences that we do, right? We have an audience here, even in Panoramas and with class, and to really use that. So here are some resources that the interns put together, and we're going to be sending some more in the next week or so. Hopefully next week, finals are happening. So I really encourage everyone here to really educate yourselves more about these issues and read the articles, and really start to think about decisions when you're, and the climate and these people and who your decisions are impacting way down the road. And thank you all so much for those of you who have come to all of our roundtables. We have had a lot. This has been a wonderful way to end the week, and a great conversation and presentation to end the semester and these every week roundtables. So really great job. Thank you so much to the Panoramas team. You guys killed it. I'm endlessly impressed. And yeah, good luck with finals, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
And if I can just say thank you, Kaylin, because it's been awesome, and you've had a lot to do with that, and you'll be missed.
Yeah, I'll miss it. I'm gonna stop recording.